Hello everyone and welcome back to the very first module, the lesson number 2, which talks about exploring the technical architecture. In this particular module, we would be discussing the Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations technical architectures. So, let's understand the very first deployment model. So we can have a cloud-based deployment, we can have an on-prem deployment. So when I talk about a cloud deployment, this is a service, pretty much a platform service provided by Microsoft, and that is completely managed by Microsoft. So the deployment always happens with the help of LCS. So I've got my Lifecycles services, the LCS portal. Right from there, we can start deploying our new environments down there. So by opting out the cloud implementation model, it will reduce your overall implementation time because the lower hardware requirements and infrastructure cost are there. When we talk about deploying humongous amount of infrastructure in case of on-prem, you need to plan the hardware capacity in advance, and more importantly, when you do that methodology, you're pretty much implementing that. In this particular case, for example, post implementation, hundreds of our developer instances would be reduced to zero. There would be very minimal number of sandboxes which we would be running after post deployment. So the kind of upscale and downscale property which is available with the cloud in on-prem, you need to plan your hardware controls accordingly and the capacity planning accordingly. So when you talk about, it's pretty much your software as a service offering from Microsoft, and in case of on-prem deployment, that is completely hosted by the organization itself. This will always stay current and updated, where in case of an on-prem deployment model, updates must be planned and executed by the customer itself. And when you talk about the cloud implementation, it's very much scalable when you talk about the scalability of those resources. And of course, you can do your planning, and hybrid approach is also an option, like putting up your production over the cloud and the sandboxes over on-prem. So pretty much you can plan accordingly whatever the infrastructure approach suits you. That's the very first thing. Now, before we go to elements, models, and packages, let me help you understanding the deployment types accordingly. So I'm taking you back to my browser in here. And let's say I'm down in here. All right, so here we are. At present, I'm inside this virtual machine. This is a one box deployment. It is a virtual machine which is hosted in our cloud data center. That's an on-prem installation of the services. Let me take you to the LCS portal over here. So I'm pretty much going to lcs.dynamics.com. It will ask me to log in, and you can log in with your authenticated credentials. Once we are successfully at our LCS portal, let's take an example. How does it work? Now, once again, to have the LCS in much more detail, that's been covered in MB500 program. Here, we are talking about LCS in the perspective of our D365 cloud deployment or an on-prem deployment. So let's take a look. I've got multiple projects over here. If I show you a couple of those things, let's say I would like to create a new project over LCS, I can do that. And depending on whether it's an on-prem implementation, whether it's a cloud hosted implementation, whether you want to do it for a migrating, creating solution and for learning purposes, whether it's for one of your prospective lead or a pre-sales demonstration, depending on whatever you want, you specify the name of the project associated, then on which product you're going to create that. So in this case, I'm utilizing finance and operations, and then specify the industry down there, whatever industry you're creating that project for. So let me go, it's for the public sector, and then have your methodology up in here, whatever methodology you can create. That's once again the LCS concept over here. And then you quickly create this particular project down there. That's one thing. Once your projects are created successfully, you'll see them listed over here, or if you're the member of the project with the defined roles. For example, if I talk about, let's say this one, I'm clicking on GTech training services, and I can have methodologies and all those things down there. What is important when you click over here, I would like to see my cloud hosted environments. So when I'm clicking on that cloud hosted environment, you'll see that it is telling me GTechLearn demo instance, which is hosted. You can see all those details with the Azure connector, with our enterprise Azure portal. You can see the login accounts and all. If I would like to see more details down there, let me click on full details over here, and it will open that environment which was hosted over LCS. So I'm seeing my cloud hosted environment right across in here. And at the same point of time, I can see various details. For example, if I would like to see some updates, I can apply those updates right from here. If you'd like to see the login details, you want to log into the machine, the RDP, you click on the password right across in here, and accordingly I can pretty much start logging into that particular machine by adding my IP to the allowed server rules. I can directly log into the VM. I can deallocate, start, stop this environment. I can apply the updates if I want to. You can see your Azure settings. So lots of details what we are seeing over here as a cloud hosted environment that's currently deployed. I can directly log into the environment right from here. Let me just go over there. And now one thing you will notice on the top, it's saying GTechLearn demo 369, whatever the demo name, .aos.cloudax.dynamics.com. This is important here, guys. I'm having my sample data, all those things, just like my on-prem, the one I was demonstrating. It's the same thing. I'm being added as an administrator, having access to all these modules down here. That's one thing, which is a portal operations, pretty much my environment available through LCS as a cloud hosted environment. If I'm looking for another one, let me show you something. I'm looking for operations.gtechlearn.com. That's our custom domain, first of all. And when I hit that, it will try loading that D365 operations for me, taking me to the login page, and will take my corporate credentials to that current login, and ideally it'll give me and take me to that particular page right across. That's what we did for our own internal training and demonstration purposes. Some of the important things I would like to tell you that. So let's take a look. The very first thing, I'm at the dashboard, which is showing right over here. And on the second environment, which is currently being loaded, I'm also on the same dashboard. So it pretty much looks the same thing with some themes changes and all, but pretty much exactly the same. What is the important thing to discuss? Anything which is having a suffix called dynamics.com, that is a cloud hosted environment which is managed by Microsoft itself. Of course, you may or may not have controls over here depending on the type. If it's a sandbox, you pretty much have full control of it. If it's a production, Microsoft's having that particular control for managing that environment. But it's on dynamics.com. The second one, I'm seeing operations.gtechlearn.com, a custom domain here. So this is an on-prem installation of the finance and operations, whereas this one is hosted over the cloud, which I was just showing you right from the LCS portal itself. So depending on the needs, you can pretty much deploy your environments right across in there. Let me take you to my PowerPoint presentation now. The next slide here talks about elements, models, and the packages which are available. So unlike AX up till AX 2012 R3, a little bit on AX 7 initial releases as well, Microsoft does have that concept of layerings down there. Now that's no longer available. Now it's been completely switched to the extensions model. We'll talk about what's the extension concept is there and how do we utilize them. So the very important thing on the top, you got a package, also referred as a software deployable package. Inside the package, you'll be having your models, whether it's a single model or multiple models, once again, depending on how you're developing. Then we'll be having projects underneath those particular models down there. And inside those projects, we will be having our actual elements, the AOT elements, whether it's a base enum or a custom class extension or a report extension or a new form or a form extension, a form customization down there. Any kind of those elements will be in there. So that's how my architecture actually flows. But in terms of development, I pretty much start by creating my model being a developer, then have my projects inside that particular model, add or customize those elements right across. And once this particular process is completed, then I pretty much combine them and export them as a software deployable package at my final approach, and we can apply them right from the LCS right across in there. So if I show you a couple of these things in here, let me take you to my virtual machine, one of my on-prem one box deployment. I'm opening up my Visual Studio over here. The very first thing, if I click on Dynamics 365, from here, I can create a deployment package, but ideally, this is the last step everyone would be doing. So first, let's say I'd like to create a new model down here. And this time I would like to call it GTL training Module01, for example. Model publisher, whatever you're specifying in here. I'm doing it on user layer, customer layer. Usually we had this concept in our previous versions of AX, and that was really important in which layer you should be customizing it. But now it's all about extensions down there, so don't worry about this field down here. Have your description, click next. And now it is important that would you be creating a new package over here, a software deployable package, or do you want to add it to an existing package? Ideally, this would be the option in a multi-developer kind of environment down there where you have VSTS, build and release pipelines. For training purposes, let me click on create a new package. Clicking next over here, important thing what you will be selecting. Pretty much you can select anything, whatever you want. What is more important for me, I'm looking for application suite. Because application suite will give me the text engine, integration model, finance and operations, the base application integration options, whatever I'm having will be giving me all these options. So you can see there are some existing packages and modules available, which you can pretty much add right across in here and start utilizing whatever you want. So you see I've got multiples over there. I've got my fleet management as well. I've got multiple extensions down there. Let me click next and create a new project based on that and make this as my default model, what will be set it up for all the elements. We'll see the properties later on. I'm clicking on finish. So ideally what I'm saying is create a new model in user layer and then create a new project underneath that particular model, and I'll start developing right across. So the moment it does, I'm seeing my unified operations project over here. When I do so, let me call it GTL FinOps Project 01. That's what I would like to call it. And important thing to say, I created a model. Inside that model, now I'm creating this project. Let me click OK. And technically, it will create a finance and operations project for me to use. Let this one gets completed. Now you see I'm having all these options over here. You can of course add new elements if you want to this particular project. So for example, if you want to add some new elements to the project and start customizing or creating them, you can use it. Or you can drag and drop from Application Explorer. So now if you see my Dynamics 365 items, whether it's related to analytics, whether it's related to code, whether it's related to my data types, base enums, EDTs, anything, whether it's related to security roles or anything, I can pretty much do that. Well, we'll be discussing that. What is important to understand, I'm talking about this project what I created in user layer, and I'm customizing inside a newly created model, GTL training model 01. That's the one which I was using. So if I take you back to my PowerPoint presentation, that's how it was working. Most importantly, it's the elements we would be creating or customizing. They would be combined or logically combined together inside your projects, which would be the part of your models. And finally, you can create your software deployable packages and apply them across environments down there. So that was one thing which we were having. Another thing they are talking about here is the metadata search. And it's really great when we talk about how do we utilize that functionality. Being a developer, sometimes it's really helpful to find out at the right place and where should we be customizing and all. So for that, If I'm clicking on Dynamics 365 menu over here, I've got the metadata search option available. Let me click down there. And now you see it is having a search query, and this is an asynchronous search service which will give me the details almost real time over here, and you'll be amazed to see how important that is. Ideally, that's my best friend when I'm start developing or doing some customizations. So let's take an example. If I would like to pass one single token just by name, by default it's taking the name. So let's take an example. I'm saying TRV expands table, for example. Well, the moment I'm doing it, by the single token whatever I specified, if I'm not saying what type is it a form or table or anything, by default that consider it as a name property. So whatever comes up, TRV travel and expense table comes up, I'm seeing all these dynamic results coming up in here. Another example of my dynamic query can be, let's say I'm talking about type, and I'm talking about this should be a form. First of all the forms where it's having cust tables, which contains cust table right across in there. So now if you see that I'm only seeing the forms, but the forms which are having cust table. Instead of form, if my table type, the object is going to be table, I'm seeing all these tables listed up in here. So depending on whatever kind of search you would like to apply in here, let's say instead of table type cust table, I would like to go for type is going to be table for sure. But I'm talking about the method over here, all right? I would like to see any method in the name which consists of insert. So whenever you specify all these options down there and you specify all these values, let's see, you're seeing the methods of all these tables where the name is insert right across in there. So you can pretty much see lots of things. I would like to see any kind of code related things down there, and any code which is pretty much returning me null, for example. And now you see that these are all the codes available which are returning us null right across in there. So you can pretty much imagine how great that functionality is going to be as far as the metadata search is considered. So when you talk about D365, we discussed about the models in here. We discussed about the metadata search. We've got multiple options which we'll be taking a look over here. So that was about the metadata search, which we can consider and start typing our query, and the result are completely asynchronous. All right. Next in the segment they are talking about is the source control. So finance and operations, currently I'm the only person working on my development environment, but usually that's not the case. We have a multi-system, multiple sandboxes, multiple developers working, might be across geographical locations, and we have to manage all those things together, kind of source control things over there. So finance and operations uses Azure DevOps, the ADO, the Azure DevOps services for CI/CD pipelines, continuous integration, and continuous deployment pipelines. It's accessible through a web browser or Visual Studio. You can connect it both ways. If, of course, it's a cloud-based offering, the Azure DevOps services. So important thing is ADO is your Azure DevOps services. Sometimes the question comes up in there. If you're talking about an on-prem implementation, that is called an Azure DevOps server for on-prem. For the cloud-based, it's natively offered by Azure. So that's known as Azure DevOps services for your CI/CD pipelines down there. When you talk about the codes associations, there are some best practices or some of the things you should consider always being a developer or a technical architect or a solution architect down there. Important thing is make sure the best practices are followed right across in here. So we would be talking about the BPAs, the best practices analyzers, the BPMs, and all those artifacts down there. Make sure you're following your organization policies. If you are using some prefix or suffix down there, make sure you always do that as a best practice, a thumb of rule. Comments should always be used. Not importantly, it's quite optional, but it's always a great practice to utilize comments in your programming. Naming standards you're following at the same time, labels you're doing, especially if you're considering a multilingual development exposures down there, you should start considering labels right across in there. So that's one quick thing in there. Next in the slide, it is talking about our lifecycle services. So lifecycle services contains plenty of tools which we can start utilizing towards our projects down there. So let's take an example of that. I'm taking you to my portal over here. Let me take you to my LCS portal, and I'm clicking on the LCS portal right across. So we will discuss a couple of things which are related to my LCS portals and how we can start utilizing those options all together. Let's quickly take an example real quick. So important thing, by default, I'm seeing the projects on the left over here and some of the global options which are available right across in there. For example, sometimes people say, hey, I've got this shared assets library, and as the name suggests, it is a shared assets library. We will be having multiple types of assets published by plenty of people across the globe in here, so anybody can start utilizing them. So let this one gets loaded, the shared assets library. In the meanwhile, let me go lcs.dynamics.com one more time, loading up my base LCS home portal. Let this one gets open real quick. All right, it's loading the shared assets library because that contains thousands of resources down there. And let me show you a couple of these things. All right, so there it's loaded in here. Let me open any of my existing project right from here. And when you see that, I'll be having the project related settings as well. So if the environments are hosted by Microsoft itself over the cloud using your partnerware subscription or anything, you'll see that into the environments listing over here, or I can see them from the cloud hosted environments, like get loaded once real quick. All right, there we are. So let's take a look over here. When I click on the project breadcrumb icon over there, the hamburger menu down there, let me click on multiple things. I can see my cloud hosted environment, the one which we were seeing previously. If you want to do some sort of code upgrade, you can always do that. Any kind of configurations related things. For example, if I would like to see my project settings, let me click on the project settings area. That'll take me to the project settings page where we can specify whether it's for a prospect, it's for a customer, and what kind of multiple things we provide right across in there. All right, so if you take a look over here, that's giving me the name of the project. Pretty much you can specify the product version, the organizations and ownerships you can specify, the partner customer prospect relationship over here. You want to integrate your SharePoint Online library over here, just specify the SharePoint site URL and have your enterprise document management site ready with LCS integration. You would like to have your DevOps, Azure DevOps up and running, so you can set up your VSTS right from there, and your Azure DevOps will start working right across in there. The Azure connector, which would be helpful while you are deploying your sandboxes to your Azure subscription, you can pretty much have it set it up over here. So the project services, the project settings gives you a couple of those things over there. If I click on the project users, that will take me to the list of users who are currently associated with this particular project with any of the roles, whether it is the project owner role, or for example, if I'm adding a new user, for example, I'm just specifying student01, and let me just have it over here. Give it a second. I'm specifying the email address. And the moment I do that, I can specify this user would be a project owner or an environment manager who can manage the cloud hosted environments, or a project team member with the BPM artifacts access, or an operations user just for the portal access for the actual end application. So depending on, we can have the project users created over here. At the same point of time, you would like to see the assets library to this particular project, not the shared one where the resources would be from across everyone down there. So you can see any kind of assets, whether it's your business process modeler artifact, whether it's your data package, whether it's your database backups, or any kind of GER configurations, or any kind of nugget packages, anything what you may have over here. you will see them into the assets library. One thing to remember, assets library is comparatively the same, but a different word is shared assets library, which is accessible across all LCS users. All right. When you go in there, you can have your work items. If your DevOps is ready, you can create your work items task, the cardboards, Kanban processings and all. Pretty much lots of things you can do right from your LCS portal down there. So these are some of the options which were visible when we talk about having our LCS portal up and running. So that was what we had as part of lesson number 2, guys, of module number 1. I should see you in lesson number 3 talking about the next features and then the set of training patterns down there. So thank you very much for being with me over this video, guys. I should see you in the next lesson. Enjoy working with Dynamics 365. Thank you very much.